Today, I'm gonna walk you through this blocky reveal logo animation made entirely inside the free 3D software Blender. That includes using curve objects to drive the base shape with geometry nodes, which makes this completely procedural, so at any time we can switch out the logo or change any of these parameters and get immediate feedback. Animating the individual logo elements and cameras with some camera shake sprinkled on top with the Camera Shakeify add-on, adding lighting and making use of light nodes for extra control, and using Blender's now GPU accelerated compositor for fast adjustments and live previews. I have provided the project files in case you want to skip having to create this from scratch, which include two Blender projects. One is the intro animation with all its bells and whistles, so you could use that, import your logo and you're good to go. And the other contains only the geometry node setup, so you can build upon it. Now, before we get started, a quick word from this video sponsor, Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Alright, so here we are now in Blender. We'll go ahead and hit F4 to import our SVG file, which in our case will be the Formula 1 logo. And by the way, you can import your own logo in here as well, or find whichever one you like by doing a Google search like I did with the Formula 1. Let's select everything, we'll hit S, scale it up, and then I want to delete the T and M letters. And we can join all of them into one object by hitting Ctrl J, and then hit F2, we'll call it logo. Right click, set origin to geometry, and then Alt G to reset its position to the middle. And by the way, if we hit N to bring up this panel on the side, you can see that the Z rotation and the XYZ scale, they are a bit off, and that's because we made adjustments to this object in object mode. So let's go ahead and apply the scale with Ctrl A. Let's bring this out of the collection and we'll delete that one. Now, because this is a curve object, we can go over to the curve data properties, and here we can set the resolution. So if we put this lower, we get these jagged lines. So let's say leave it at 32. And then for the render resolution, if you leave it set to 0, it's just gonna copy what the preview resolution is. And let's set the fill mode to none to avoid any issues later down the line. Now let's go over to the modifiers tab and then add a geometry nodes modifier. Then we'll bring this panel up, switch it to the geometry node editor and hit new, either here or over here. And then we'll call it blocky reveal. And we actually want to use the group input because we want to use the curve object. So let's start by adding a curve to mesh node. And we want to actually use this as the profile curve. Then we'll drag out a curve line. And to see what this does, we can hold down Ctrl Shift left click to bring up a viewer node. And that's, I believe, only possible if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, and I would suggest you always keep this enabled. So the curve line node generates a line between the start and end point. In this case, the Z value is the depth. So let's get rid of the viewer node and let's set it to 0.5. But we also want to close the bottom and top faces with the fill caps option. And we'll actually start creating group inputs as we go. So I want to be able to access or modify the Z value on the go. And we can't just plug this right into a new group input because that will just create a vector parameter. Instead, I will drag this out into a combine XYZ node, which will give us a separate socket for each axis. And then we can drag the Z value into a group input, hit N to bring up this panel on the side, and then we'll rename that group input, let's say depth. So now we can adjust that over here. A quick side note, if we enable the face orientation, you might notice sometimes that you have these faces that are flipped inwards. And a quick and easy way to fix that would be to go into edit mode with tab and just hover over one of these splines, hit L to select linked, and then right click, switch direction, and that will solve your issue. I want to also demonstrate something just in case you maybe see this where everything is switched. You could either do that in the edit mode, switch the direction, or you can just add a flip faces node after the curve to mesh, and that will just flip those faces in the geometry nodes. And in fact, there's also a reverse curve node, which you would have to bring before the curve to mesh because this only works with curves. So if you bring this over here, because this is now a mesh, it will give you this error. So those are a few solutions, but I'll just go back into edit mode, right click, switch the direction there. Then let's add a transform geometry node after the curve to mesh. And we'll drag out from the translation into another combine XYZ because I want to target the Z value, and then just drag and drop this in here, and we'll call it height. So now we can set the depth as well as bring it up or down. And let me turn off the face orientation. And let's quickly create a new material. We'll remove the default material that comes in with SVG files. We'll create a new one, and let's call it base. And before we make any changes, let's just add a set material node right after, and then we'll apply that base material. By the way, we can still see this SVG material, even though we deleted it from here. So I'll just go over to the Blender file view mode. Under materials, I'll just delete it over here. And that basically deleted it from the entire project file. Alternatively, you could just go over to File, Cleanup, Purge Unused Data, which will delete any unused data. That means materials, objects, images, what have you. Now let's go ahead and add a reddish color. We have to switch to the material preview mode. And also, while I'm at it, let's go over to the render properties and just make sure you're using the Chronos PBR neutral view transform, which is a new view transform with Blender 4.2, I believe, which is very similar to standard, but it does retain highlights a bit more. And I would suggest you use the Chronos view transform whenever you're working on any product shots or any animations that require you to keep your colors as similar to the brand colors of a client, for example, instead of using AGX or even Filmic, which sometimes make it hard to get rich colors. Now back over to the material tab, we can crank up the metallic value and then maybe lower the roughness so it's a bit more shiny. Now let me just change the hue of this color a little bit, maybe bring up the value something like that. And in fact, we can go over to the coat and then increase the weight. Basically, the coat gives us another layer on our surface, which is usually used on car surfaces. And if I go over here, let's say make this roughness very low, and then under the coat roughness, we can maybe bring up the weight so you can see it more. And then you can see that we have this sort of secondary layer of paint. The first one is shinier, and then the second one is a bit more diffused. But we want to keep this first roughness a bit higher, and then this second one just somewhere along those lines. And then you can tweak the weight value. Now let's join all of these nodes into a new frame with Control J. We'll call it layer 1, hit N. Under node, we can increase the label size and then enable the color. And let's say set it to something like that. And now we'll go ahead and add a cube node. We'll leave it at the top here for the moment. And let's go ahead and add a mesh Boolean node, set it to intersect, and then plug both of these into the same mesh Boolean, and then plug this into the group output. So the mesh Boolean node is basically the same as the Boolean modifier, which we can't add right now because remember, we're using a curve object. It's pretty much the same, trust me. So where these guys intersect with each other, that's what's going to be visible to us. And in fact, let me just join these, Control Shift right click again. And then in between here, we can turn this mesh to curve just to visualize that box. And see now, as we scale this up on the X, it's revealing more of the logo. And then on this direction, let's just set it to 5 by 5 by 5. And then we can use a transform geometry node to move this around. But first, let me just shift right click, join these into one, and then we'll plug the transform geometry in between. So now as we move this to the left and right, we're revealing the logo. I'll just make sure the size is wide enough to cover everything we might need. We don't need it to be that high on the Z. We'll set it to 3 as well as 3 on the Y. Now off of this transform geometry, let's grab the translation into another XYZ combine, and we'll use the X and Y into our group input. And by the way, when you drag values into a group node, it will just create a new node for you, as well as create a new group input. But at the same time, it will only keep that plugged in value visible. And you can toggle the visibility of everything else by hitting Control H, which will show and hide unused parameters. So let's show that, and then we'll use the Y as well. And we'll call these trim horizontal and trim vertical. Now I'm aware that we're moving the box, but in the case of using the mesh Boolean, it makes sense to call it trim horizontal instead of move horizontal, because we are trimming the logo. Now you can see here that as we trim this, there's one thing that's bugging me, and that's the orientation of the box. So the logo itself, it's sheared about 45 degrees this way, whereas the box is just cutting it straight through like that. So let's go ahead and add some shear functionality. And by the way, just real quick to demonstrate, I'll add a new plane. We'll bring it over here. We'll tab into edit mode, hit F3, and just search for shear. And this is what shearing means, is you're just distorting it diagonally. So let's make some room right over here. And we'll start by adding a set position node, which will allow us to offset this in any direction. But we want to isolate those axes. So let's click and drag out of it, and we'll go into a combine XYZ node. Then we'll use the X value into a math multiply, and just stay here with me for a moment. This will all make sense. On the first value, we'll drag out again, and this time we'll do separate XYZ, and we'll use the Y axis. And then finally, we'll get the position of this object with the position node. By itself, this node doesn't contain any information. It just serves as a getter of information in the context of the set position node. And just so you can understand this better, I'll make sure to leave a link in the description that directs you to a tutorial by Arendelle, and he goes a lot more in depth with explaining how these nodes work. Now let me set this over here, and let's just look at the top view. Right now the B value on the multiply node is set to 0.5. Let's just leave it down to 0, so we have it just like it was before. But as we multiply it more and more, you can see we're starting to shear this object. And I believe it was 1, which allowed us to get this perfect 45-degree angle. And I can confirm that by adding a cube, hit RZ45, and there you have that angle matching perfectly. So now we have this trimming that goes better with the F1 logo. Now let me also bring all of these back inside the layer 1 panel. And I'll go ahead and delete the join geometry and the mesh to curve node here that we had just for visualization purposes. Then we can select this point, hit Control X to dissolve it while also keeping these connections, and then Control right click to delete that one. But also make sure you go right into the group output because we no longer need to see that cube. We understand what's going on. And now we're gonna create the layer 2, which we can simply do by duplicating everything. But before I do that, I want to actually group all of these nodes into one node group because we are gonna be reusing the shearing later down the line. So instead of leaving all of these out in the open, we can hit Control G with all of them selected. And now if you tab out of it, you have this simple, clean looking node group. Now let's go back inside. And the only value I want to expose to the group input is the B value of the multiply node. And we'll call that shear. Then tab back out. And we'll drag this all the way in here. And that will automatically name it to shear. So now we have this. We can trim it. We can also trim it on the vertical, which remember behind the scenes, it's actually just moving the box. And for this animation, I don't think we're going to use the trim vertical, but it's nice to have it there. We'll leave the shear set to 1. And there's our first layer. In fact, let me just go 0.3 on the depth. Now let's select all of these, including the group input, hit Shift D to duplicate. We'll start by renaming this to layer 2. Then let's full screen this window. We can hit N and let's just create a new panel. We'll call it layer 1 and we'll drag insert these into the panel. Then we'll select this one, duplicate the item, and this time we'll call it layer 2. Remember now here we just need to make sure we switch these around. So hold Control and then click on the depth just so you can switch that in socket. Same for the height. Then you can hit Control H to hide unused sockets. Do the same over here, trim vertical, switch it with a layer 2 sockets, as well as the shear. We'll hide those. And now all we have to do is make sure that we join these two together. And you can do that, remember, with Control Shift H, right click, that will create a new join geometry and join those two together. And now we can set the height for the second layer and the depth. So we can bring this up a bit. Let's say make this a bit thinner. Maybe let's say 0.1 and 1. So now we have individual trimming control. Now let's go ahead and disconnect this joint geometry because I want to start focusing on creating the wireframes. Let's start by adding a group input and let's just drag the geometry out into a curve to mesh node. And this time we'll use that as the curve itself. And then in the profile curve, we'll use a curve circle. And of course, we do need to bring this group output up here and connect it over. Now this is huge, so we need to scale down the radius. Let's say 0.001. This is a very sensitive value, so maybe we could go ahead and add a math node, set it to multiply, then set the top value to 0.001. And then this second value will be much easier to control. You can even hold down Shift for smaller increments. And also, I find that it's kind of annoying to have the outline selected overlay when you're working with wireframes, so we can turn that off. Now, right away, you might notice there's an issue. The thickness of the wireframe is uneven. There's a certain thickness over here, and then over here it's a bit thinner. Same on this corner, same on this corner. Now, you could go into edit mode with tab, and let's say select this top point, hit Alt-S to increase the radius of the point. And you can see that if you hit N, that value, we can do the same thing here. But this requires manual tweaking, and then sometimes you might not be able to fix it properly. And this is just an issue with how the curve to mesh node works. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you will get this issue where you have uneven thickness along your curve. So I'll show you a workaround. I'll hover over the corner of this window, click and drag to split it. I'll switch over to the asset browser. And then under the geometry nodes location, I have this node group called even thickness. I can click and drag it and then close this window. Now, if we tab inside of it, you can see how this is set up. Now, disclaimer, I did not create this. This was actually made by a guy called Ep.11. I'll leave a link to that video in the description because he's a lot more qualified to explain how any of this works. I just copied over the node setup and saved it in my asset browser. Huge thanks to Ep.11 for sharing a bunch of wonderful Blender related videos, so do check him out. Now, all we have to do to make this work is to plug the even thickness before the curve to mesh. And then after the curve to mesh, we can use a set position node and just make sure you plug the vector into the position. And if we go over to the top view, I can disable the set position, which disables the effect of this. Now I'll go ahead and drag the second value here into another group input and just make sure we call this thickness. Control H, hide those other ones. Now let's add the trimming functionality to this as well with a trim curve node. Bring it before the even thickness. And now we can tweak the end value to trim those curves. Now, one thing you might notice is that these seem to be starting from random points. And I want to be able to start the trimming, let's say from this corner on each spline. And also I want it to go the other way around. So we can set the end all the way to 1 and then use the start value. So to fix the first issue, let's go into edit mode. Make sure you have this object selected. And under preferences, add-ons, curve tools, you need to enable this one. So when you tap N, go into the edit panel, you have this set first points option under utilities. So now let's select this point, shift select that one to add to the selection and set first points. Let's just right click, switch direction. Now that fixes the issue. And now even before that, we can go reverse curve into geometry nodes. And now we'll have those lines going in the opposite direction. Now I want to be able to control the reversing with a button switch in the modifiers tab. So let's add a switch node and we'll plug the geometry into false, which is the unaltered curve object. Plug the output into the trim curve and then the reversed curve will plug into true. So now when we check the switch box, this switch node will output true, which is the reversed curve. And if it's off, it will output false, which is the unaltered curve. And let's click and drag this switch into a socket and we'll call it reverse. And let's plug the end as well. We'll call it trim, bring it up top. So now we can trim this curve and then decide whether we want to reverse it or not. And one more thing I forgot to mention is that these curves, they are open and that's got to do with the fill caps option. But now when we check it and let's say put the trim down to 0, you're still gonna be able to see that circular shape, which is coming from the profile curve. So let's say after the trim curve, we'll add another switch node and we'll plug it into true. So if this is checked, it will output the curve. If this is unchecked, it will output nothing. And for the switch, we are gonna use a compare node set to greater than, and we'll plug the trim value into value A. And make sure we're just using float because integers are round numbers and float values can also contain decimals. So if the trim value is greater than 0, then this will output true. But if it's not, it will output false. So now when the trim is set to 0, we'll get nothing. And as soon as we drag this up, the curve will appear. Now let's do some house cleaning here. Now let's join these two and we'll just call them even thickness. We'll join all of these into another one called wireframe. And let's increase the label size. We'll change the color to green. And also create a new panel, which we'll call wireframe, and plug everything inside of it. At this point, let's add a new material. We'll call it glow. set the emission strength to about 5, and then just set that material onto the wireframe. And let's switch this to the compositor window and add a glare node in between, set it to fog glow, and then enable the real-time compositor. So now we can see what that does. And we can use the mix to determine how much glow we want. Maybe increase the size to 9. Now let's go ahead and multiply this wireframe instead of duplicating the whole panel like we did with the layers. And we can do that by adding an instance on points node. And by the way, this is one of those nodes that you will be using a lot if you work with geometry nodes. So you can actually add this to favorites. If you search for it, then right click, add to quick favorites. And then you can hit the Q button to access those quick favorites and just click on it to quickly put it down instead of having to search for it all the time. Now we want to use the wireframe we created as an instance. Now for the points, we want to use a mesh line, which compared to the curve line node also gives us this count. So then we can decide how many of these we want. And the gap between them will be based on the start location and the offset values. So if I decrease the Z value to 0.5, each one of these counts will be 0.5 meters away from each other in the Z axis. And we'll set it to 2 for the time being and leave the offset to 1. We'll drag and drop the count into a group input, which we can drag inside of this wireframe panel. And now we have access to it here. And in fact, let me just switch this into a combine XYZ and then plug this into a group input. I'll call this one depth as well. Insert after this count socket. But now an issue we have is, let's say I want to introduce more copies, but keep the distance the same. We would have to tweak the depth. Then when we increase the count, maybe tweak it again just to bring them together. And that's a bit of a hassle. So how can we automate this? Well, we're going to use some math. So first, let's set the count to 2. Then we'll set the depth to 1. And we'll use these simple round numbers just for demonstration purposes. We'll start by adding a math node, and we'll plug it before the combine XYZ. And let's set it to divide, and we'll divide the depth by the count. So basically, 1 divided by 2 is 0.5, and you can see the result of these two values being divided if you hover over the value socket here, so that's 0.5. Hence, the distance between these two copies is 0.5. But that's not quite accurate, so let's just add another math node, insert it in between the count here, and set it to subtract, and subtract it by 1. So what we are saying is subtract 1 by the count number, so 2 minus 1 is 1, and then divide it by the depth, which will again give us 1. So now when we increase the count, you can see the top copy stays put, and then we're just distributing more copies in between those two and keeping the correct distance. And now we can just increase the depth and then set to use how many copies we want without having to do any manual tweaking, going back and forth and back and forth. So just some simple math with a couple of nodes to fix that problem. And now we can clean things out a bit here. And real quick, let's join all of these together now. And plug the join geometry back inside. And here's what we have so far. Again, we'll cut off the link with the group output. And now let's start working on the pieces. So let's bring the wireframes all the way at the bottom. Then we have layer 1. Then we have some pieces in between that we're going to create now. And then layer 2. So here is where we'll create the pieces. I like to also keep things laid out in the geometry nodes in a way that makes sense with the final result. So let's bring the group output in here. We'll start by adding a cube. And a quick and lazy way to connect these two is to use Alt, right click and drag, and that will just connect it right away. And this first cube we'll use as a volume where we'll scatter a bunch of other boxes inside of it. So you might have guessed it, mesh to volume node. We have to turn this into a volume first so we can distribute points in the volume. Now I do like to visualize things, so let's turn this mesh to curve and then join these just so I can see what's happening. First, let's increase the size so we have some more room for points to be spawned in. And I want to make this quite big, so let's say 40 by 5 and maybe 2. So now we have a bunch of these points. And then again, we can hit Q to access the quick favorite instance on points. And for the instance, we want to use another cube. And now we have a cube party. They are a bit big though, so let's just set the size. You can click and drag down on all three of them and go 0.1. But we want to have some randomness on the scale, so you can click and drag that out and type in random value, which will create a random value node and switch the type to vector because this is a vector parameter. And now we can say leave the minimum to like 3. Y size minimum is something like that. And the Z, we can set it to 1. But then the max on the X is quite high, maybe a bit on the Y, and then maybe not so much on the Z. We can just play around with these to get whatever you want. Of course, you have the density either on the distribute points in volume or the mesh to volume node. I'll just use the density in the distribute points in volume to determine how many points we're spawning in. And you can also just change the seed to get different results. So let's add a group input here. We'll click and drag the density in, maybe the seed as well. Then the size of the first cube, which remember is the spawn area, let's call it. Then we can also drag the minimum and maximum values of the random scale on the cube instances. Then let's add a transform geometry after the instance on points. And here we'll also use the translation to move them all around at once or even squish them down on the z-axis. So I'm going to plug the translation into another group input. We'll do it over here just so we don't have to drag lines from all the way across. And then we'll do the scale as well. Then Control H, hide those. We can then start organizing them a bit. So let's create a new panel. We'll call it pieces. Insert into panel, density seed. And also let's duplicate the transform geometry, plug it in here. And we use this same one over here so that as we move this, the visualization on those bounds is correct. And then I want to be able to toggle the visualize bounds. So we'll add a switch node, plug it after transform geometry. And if it's true, we want to visualize those bounds. If it's false, we don't want to show anything. Now let's just drag this out into a group input and we'll call it visualize bounds and plug it right at the top there. So now we can turn that on and off in case we want to see where those pieces are spawning. We'll click and drag these back here just to make some more room because we're going to be adding a few more things. Starting with the logo itself, which again, we're going to use a mesh Boolean for. And I'll just go ahead and select all of these nodes down here. Control C to copy, paste them over here. Don't worry about linking them up. As of now, we'll just delete all of those. And we don't need the set material. We're only using this as a Boolean. And let's drag it over here. We want to plug this last transform geometry into the mesh Boolean so they join together. And then the mesh Boolean output itself goes into the joint geometry and we can delete this one. And it will go away because the depth here is not set and we're not using a profile curve at all. So let's duplicate this group input at the bottom. We don't need to be able to control the position or the height of the pieces because we already have that functionality with the transform geometry node here. That's this position XYZ. So all we need is the depth into the combine XYZ and the geometry of our curve itself into the profile curve. Of course, this is using values or parameters from the layer 1 or layer 2, whichever one it was, layer 1, I guess. So let's go up here and we'll add an input called depth, bring it at the top, maybe after the visualize bounds, and then use that into the Z. So now we can set the depth and you can see that the pieces are still not showing up, even though we have set this up correctly. And that's got to do with the fact that we still are using instances. So after the instance on point, we have to type in realize instances, drop that in there. And now we can see our pieces and we can start making changes. So let's say, first of all, I just want to squish them all down. Then we can tweak the minimum and maximum size on them. Also, we can increase the depth to determine where those pieces are visible. Now let's decrease the size a little bit on the minimum. And I want to be able to see as many points as possible so we can increase the density. Now you may get these weird glitches sometimes, and that's just the way the mesh Boolean works. You have to be careful because it can easily break and also it does tank your performance. I believe the Blender developers are working on a different type of mesh Boolean generation, which is going to be both faster and more accurate. And in fact, let me just push this up a bit so we can have it stay within the center of our logo. And one more thing we can add is right after the distribute points in volume, we can add a merge by distance node. We can Control Shift click on it just to visualize it. So as we increase this, it will start merging points together that are within this distance threshold. So if this point and this point meet the distance threshold, they will merge into one point. Therefore, we're going to have less points closer to each other, as a result causing less artifacts when using the mesh Boolean. And we can just click and drag this into another group input, and we'll call it merge spawn points. And now we can increase the merge spawn points so we're not spawning boxes as close to each other. And this way, I believe we're not going to have as many glitches. If you ever do happen to have some glitches, like right here, for example, tweak the density, increase the merge spawn points, or even change the seed. So let's now join all of these into one panel. Control J. We'll call it pieces. Maybe make it blue in color. Increase the label size. And then down here, let's select all of these ones so we know what's happening. We can call this one logo. And then these 4 ones, visualize bounds. I want to also add that shearing functionality. So let's go ahead and find that shear group node. And in fact, just so we can find it a bit easier, we can also join this and rename that shear. Do the same thing for the second layer and simply copy, paste it over here. And we want to use it after the transform geometry. So just plug it right down there and then plug this into a group input, which we'll call shear, and then drop it all the way at the bottom here. And now when we click and drag the group output here, Alt right click, join them into the group, and then output the group into the group output. There we have our pieces, the first layer, the top layer, and the wireframes. And now it's actually better that we can see all of them at once, because now we can start positioning this. Let's squish these pieces down, and then we'll move them up. I want them to stay in between these 2 layers. Maybe we can lower down the merge spawn points so we have more of those points, increase the density. At a certain point, if you increase the merge spawn points, it doesn't matter if you increase the density. It's not going to do much, because even though you are spawning more points, you're still merging points that are close to each other. So at that point, the density is ineffective. We can squish them down even more. And now as we move the position of these points, we get that effect. And if you find the bounds to be a bit distracting, you can just uncheck those and just focus on the logo itself. Now let's go ahead and add some materials to these pieces. And an obvious thing we could do is first, let's just set a material and then just use the glow. That's a bit too much, and I want to be able to add different kinds of materials to different cubes. And to do that, we're gonna have to set up a communication system between geometry nodes and shaders. So let's create a new material. We'll call it pieces. Set that over here. And then we can split the window. Let's switch this to the shader editor. And here, of course, we can set the color just as before. And now we can't just go ahead and type in object info and plug this random into the base color, because we're using the realize instances node. And at this point, it's treating all of these individual pieces as one big object. Now, if we disable this, we're not going to be able to see anything because we're using the Boolean, but we could, for the time being, just plug this in here and delete the mesh Boolean, just to demonstrate to you that now, because they are instances and we're using the random object info socket into the base color, we do get these random colors that range from white to black. And then we can use, say, a color ramp node. Let's say set this to constant, so we have this harsh cut. Add more points here, distribute stops evenly, and then change these colors. But how do we get this while still using the realize instances? Because we need that node to be able to merge the pieces with the logo inside of the mesh Boolean. Well, in that case, I'm going to enable the realize instances just so we can see what's going on. And we need to store the attributes of those instances before we realize them. We do that by adding a store named attribute node. We'll plug it after the instance on points, but before the realize instances. Then we want to set this data type to vector, because vectors are X, Y, Z, and those correspond to RGB values, which are red, green, blue. So it's going to work with colors. Then let's make sure the domain we're using is instances, and into the value, we'll plug in a random value. And we also need to assign a name to this attribute. We'll do random color, because then we can access this inside of the shader editor. We can search for attribute, type in random color, make sure the name matches exactly to this attribute name, disconnect the object info node, as well as the color ramp, just so I can plug this straight into the base color. And there we have a bunch of random colors. And just to go over this one more time, the store named attribute node doesn't do anything to our geometry when we plug it in here. It's just serving as a box to contain information. And then we're accessing that information in the shader editor. And then we simply access that attribute before it gets processed down the line in the shader editor to drive random colors on different pieces. Now we can plug the color ramp and we can decide what colors to use over here. If we want more blue, let's just delete these. We can drag the blue up. So now we have more pieces that are colored blue and less pieces that are pink. But of course, we're going to use different colors. Let's first just delete the object info node, reset the color ramp, but switch it back to constant. So we have this black and white. But let's disconnect it from the base color. I'll go back to the base material, copy this shader, paste it over here, and just plug it in. Let's delete this one. And I just want to make this one a bit darker, so we can differentiate between the pieces and the base layers. Then I want to add an emission shader. This is how it looks like by itself. But I want to mix these two shaders together with a mix shader node. And the factor, I want it to be driven by our random colors. And now we can tweak this color ramp to determine if we want more glowing pieces or more metallic red colored pieces. Now, do be warned that as soon as we plug the output here into the mesh Boolean and then join this into the geometry. And in fact, let me switch this around so we have less glowing pieces. For some reason, because of how mesh Boolean node works, again, it's a bit glitchy. So you have these weird cutoff shapes. And then also we can go back to the modifiers tab and let's say move the pieces. You can see they're kind of jumping around. So at some point it decides, oh, well, this is a glowing piece. And then as we move it along, now it turns into this metallic piece. Anyway, let's also increase the emission strength to maybe 5 to match the wireframe glow. And that's pretty much all there is to the logo. Now we can go ahead and start creating a scene, add some lighting, some camera animation, animate the logo itself, and then do some compositing and finally render this out. We'll start by adding in a plane and we'll scale this up, call it background, and we'll give it a new material. Let's call it background as well. And let's make it like dark gray, maybe increase the metallic, decrease the roughness. And also at this point, let's just switch to cycles so we can see how that looks and disable the scene world as of now, just so we can use this random HDRI. These edges are 100% sharp. So we can go over to the modifiers tab, select the logo and just add a bevel modifier. Right away, as soon as we added the bevel, you can see we have this sharp line with a reflection, and that's because it's catching the light reflection. And we can increase the segments and then maybe try to increase the amount, but it's not gonna work because the clamp overlap is checked, which means it's not gonna go past any point where you have overlapping geometry. And of course, in this case, it's gonna happen quite a lot because we have these weird shapes. Also, we gotta fix the shading here by maybe clicking the harden normals. Maybe set it to like 0.002. And even then you might have some artifacts. So as we toggle this on and off, look at that. That just looks a lot better. So let's start by bringing these pieces out of the view. Let's just push them out of there. Then we'll trim horizontal, decrease that until we can't see these shapes anymore. Same with layer 2. And also on the wireframe, I want to use only one count. This way I can just focus on animating this guy. Now let's merge these two windows and we'll switch to the timeline window. Now let's go to the beginning here, maybe delayed by 10 frames. And let's set the trim to 0, hit the stopwatch here, move forward to about 40 frames, and then set this back to 1 and add a keyframe. By the way, I'm using 30 frames per second, I believe. No, I'm not. Let's just set it to 30. And now we can see how that looks like. You can hit Control Tab while hovering over the timeline, which will switch you to the graph editor. And here, let's just normalize these. So these values get clamped between a value of -1 to 1. So now we can maybe scale this up on the X a bit. Just tweak the easing. And maybe let's say halfway through, we can have the first layer come in. Let's go to the top view. Let's just move this in. Up, right there we can see it. Let's set a keyframe and then move forward and then bring this all the way just until we hit the corner there. Set a keyframe and then we can select this one, hit Shift H to hide all the unselected channels. So now let's also ease this in. Now let's bring in the pieces. So over here, we can slide these out. Let's set a keyframe and we'll go over to, let's say 200 and then bring them all the way out to the other side until we can no longer see them. Set another keyframe, drag this out so they start slow, but then they just shoot out like crazy. And in fact, I don't want them to come to a slow stop. I just want them to shoot off the screen to the side there. So now if we go to the top view, start slow and then they just keep going. But I think it's taking way too long and also starting very slow. See how that looks like. It's gonna take some trial and error. We can disable these overlays and then bring this even further. And by the way, you will be lagging. As you see, this is not playing in real time because of the mesh Boolean node. So let's switch back to the timeline with Control Tab. Under playback here, we can set the sync to frame dropping. And now, even though we're going to be dropping some frames, it's still going to show you the proper preview so you can get a better idea as to what the final animation will be like. So now I'm seeing that I need to push this so it takes a bit longer. And then as these go out, I want the second layer to come in. So let's say right there. Let's move forward frame by frame with the left and right arrows. Set a keyframe here and then move forward a bit and then move this all the way to the other side. Set a keyframe there. And I want this to immediately shoot out so we can rotate it, scale it up. So as soon as it comes in, it's already at that point, and then we want to drag this so it has a very smooth stop. So now that momentum of the pieces moving from left to right, it gets carried over to the final layer coming in. So they go... It's a bit hard to see actually from this view. Yeah, you can see that a bit better now. And also one thing I wasn't able to figure out, you see these channel names? It's socket underscore 16 425. And I'm guessing it's based on the order of which we added nodes. And as far as I know, we're not able to rename these. And even though we did set the names on the group inputs here, those names are not being used in the channels for the keyframes, which makes it a bit confusing to know, okay, which keyframes were these? Was this about the first layer? Oh yeah, it was, because I have to move it. No, actually it wasn't. It's for the wireframe trimming. So I don't know if this is how it's supposed to be or if they haven't implemented the feature yet where you have the same group input names showing up in the channels here, but it would be good to have because this is very confusing. Now let's split this view because we'll start adding some cameras now, and I want to keep all the UI elements visible here and then keep this as a clean view. So we'll add a new camera. I will drag it over, and here on this view, we can hit 0 on the numpad to jump to the camera view. And then we can drag this up here so we can see what's happening. And let's hit Alt-R to reset the rotation, and then RX just to angle it that way. And we can even switch to local mode just to drag it out like this. And let's see, where do we want the final location for our camera to be? Maybe bring it up a bit, maybe even go higher and then tilt down more. And let's do some house cleaning here. We'll bring these into the objects collection. Then we'll add a new collection, call it cameras, bring this inside. And then we'll add an empty and call it camera track 2. And on the camera itself, we'll go over to the constraint tab and then add a track 2 constraint and use that empty we created as the target. So now regardless of where we put our camera, it's always gonna look at that empty. And I can push it back a bit, bring it up, and then also increase the focal length to maybe 85. And maybe bring this track 2 constraint up a bit on the Z axis. So now when we move this down, we get this nice depth. Let's go over to the Object Properties tab. Let's hover over the location parameters and hit I to insert a keyframe. We'll bring these over right at frame 60 because we're going to use 2 cameras and we want this to start going upwards from this point on. So let's set a keyframe on frame 200, I, and then go back to that frame and then bring it down as well as push it out a bit. And then hit I again to update those keyframes. And we want to hit T and switch all of them to linear so they have this constant motion. And then we'll duplicate this camera. Let's make sure we delete the track 2 constraint. And we'll call it camera 1. And this one we'll call camera 2. Camera 2, track 2. And we want to use markers to switch between these 2 cameras. So let's go over to frame 60. We'll add a marker, select camera 2, And with the marker selected, hit Ctrl B, which will bind camera 2 to that marker. And then we'll go to frame 0 and then select the camera 1. We have to create a marker first and then Ctrl B to bind it. We're gonna look through the camera 1's perspective until we hit the camera 2 marker, which will then switch to that camera. Now, of course, we do need to now tweak camera 1. And a quick way to actually set up a camera angle, if we go over here to the view, we can lock the camera to the view. So now as we move around, the camera view is actually changing. And what I even like to do is just hit Shift tilde key, which is right below the escape key. And this will take us into fly mode, where we can then use the WASD keys, just like we would in a video game, for example, to fly the camera around, and then use the scroll speed to increase or decrease the camera movement speed, and then aim with your mouse. And I believe you can hold down Alt for finer movement like that. Use E and Q to ascend and descend. And then as soon as you're ready, you can just hit left click to confirm. Or if you're flying and you want to cancel the movement, just right click to cancel and it will take you back to its position. And now let's go back to frame 0. Wait, what? All right, we had keyframes on our camera. So let's delete those and let's go ahead and just fly again. That looks good. Now let's go back to frame 0, go to object data properties. Let's add a keyframe for both the location and the rotation. Let's move forward and let's make sure we set the pivot point to the 3D cursor and make sure the cursor is set to the world origin with Shift S. So now when we select the camera and we rotate it, the rotation pivot point is based on the cursor. So now we can just double click R to go into free rotation mode and just rotate things like that. And then maybe tilt it a little bit just so we can get this nice angle. And once you have that set up, we can hit I again, select all of these guys, set them to linear, and just push these last keyframes over the frame of 60, just so we know for sure we have constant movement. In fact, on camera 1, I might want to increase the focal length a bit more. And then also animate the focal length on the camera 2. Maybe set a keyframe here, and then over on frame 200, we can go back to 50 millimeters, so we're zoomed out a bit. And let's set a keyframe. Now let's expose the focal length keyframes. We can select all of them and hit View, Frame Selected. I have mine set to the Z shortcut. We can rotate this, so it's constantly zooming out, right? But then at this point, we want to have a steep curve angle. So we can scale this up with S, and then also scale up this point. See that steep turn? Now we just want to make sure it's positioned right at the time where the second layer comes in. I think we might have an easier time tweaking this if we uncheck normalize. Something like that. It's zooming out and then woof, we get this big push. But we might need to zoom out a bit further down. Oops. See, there's a bit of delay. Right here is where we need that steep angle on the curve. Yep, that looks good. And then we continue to zoom out. And by the way, this is distracting. We can go to the camera settings, viewport display, and increase passpart 2. So now everything outside of the bounds of it will be black, and that helps you focus in. When it comes to the camera animation, I believe the last detail I added was some camera shake, and I did that with the Camera Shakeify add-on, but I'll leave a link to it in the description. So we can add some maybe Handycam Run preset. Now we can decrease the influence, so it's not as intense. Then maybe increase the speed to about 3, so we have faster paced shake. Let's say influence 0.1, maybe decrease the scale as well. And then try to match the timing of the shake to start happening as the pieces are coming in. So at frame 60, we can set a keyframe, put it down to 0, move forward a bit, and then bring it back down to 0.1, insert and replace the keyframe, then go all the way here, and just before it stops, we can set another keyframe, and then move forward a bit more and set it back down to 0 and set a keyframe. Now let's just make sure, I don't believe we updated this. Yeah, we have to set it to 0 and then right click, replace keyframe. Now on the influence, we can frame that and just see what's going on. So we start shaking. I think that's a bit too much. So let's just tone it down and we can ease this. Maybe tone it down even more. Now let's tweak the lighting. And first of all, I actually want to import an HDRI because as of now, we're just using default HDRIs that come with Blender. But if we were to use the scene world, you'll see it's all black because we don't have any lights in our scene and we're not using an HDRI. It's just set to a default color and we get this bland look. So let's head over to Polyhaven, where you can find free assets such as HDRIs, textures, and models. Let's search for Studio, and we'll grab this one. Let's do 1K download, and let's make some room and switch over to the shader editor and go into the world type. Control T, which is a feature that is also part of the Node Wrangler add-on. That will add an environment texture, texture coordinate, and mapping node. Now we can open the HDRI we downloaded. You can see how that looks as we orbit around. Now one thing I want to do is get rid of all of the colors. So let's add a hue saturation node and then decrease the saturation, set it down to 0 so we have no colors. That way it doesn't shift any colors in our logo. And here we'll switch to the cycles renderer now and also make sure that is toggled. Let's increase the strength and then we can start rotating this. So let's see, where are we? Maybe we can rotate on the Z, but I want to push it down on the Z just a little bit so we get this reflection from the wireframe. And now I can go back to the material, maybe increase the roughness a bit more and maybe even make it a bit brighter. And now let's add a new light. We'll do area light, bring it up top, make sure it's pointing downwards. Then we'll go to the light settings. Let's switch this to a rectangle so we can control the X and Y size independently. And let's make this just a big softbox and then we'll move it back a bit. Let's switch the pivot point to the bounding center. RX, scale it up even more. And then we'll increase the intensity. And also be aware that as you cycle through the frames, and I'm doing this by the way with Alt and then using the scroll wheel to go forwards and backwards. As we go on a lower angle, we're gonna be reflecting that HDRI a bit more. So just be aware of that. You might have to tweak the rotation and then also the light. But now you can see that the logo itself, it just looks too flat. It almost looks like it's 2D. So to add some extra interest, let's first move this into a new collection called Lights. Call it Key Light. Then we'll duplicate it and then scale it down on the Y-axis. So we have this thin strip and then also scale it down over on this side. And then let's just move it so it hits the logo. And I want this to be very thin. So something like that. And then switch to logo, maybe pull it closer to the logo. Again, I'm moving it here, but I'm paying attention to what it's doing over on the camera view. But now it's also affecting the ground. And I actually don't want that. I want to isolate this light just to the logo. And I'll start by first renaming this to accent light. And this is where cycles comes clutch because we can use a light linking. That can be found under object properties, shading, light linking. And now if we just create a new group here, let's say logo accent, drag and drop the logo in here and just tell it to include the logo, which means it will not affect anything else other than the logo. Alternatively, we could say bring the background in. Let's delete the logo here and just set it to off. So now this is saying affect anything but the background. But this is a bit more extra work because say we add any other objects, we would just have to constantly add those objects into the list and then disable them. Whereas if we import the logo, we can tell it to affect that and nothing else, which is a lot simpler. And another light I added was a sweeping light that goes from left to right. And simple, again, we can just duplicate this. And this time we can size it on this way and maybe decrease the intensity. We'll do the same thing over here actually, 200%, 250. And this we'll call sweep light. I also want to match the angle of the sweep light to the angle of the logo. So let's go RZ and then just rotate it like so. Switch to global. Let's move it over here, maybe tighten it just so I can focus on the angle of that light. So RZ, I think that looks good. And remember, you can always just bring this closer to the logo to have sharper reflections, but also that has to do with the material itself on the logo. If we decrease the roughness, then it's gonna be ultra reflective like a mirror. You can see the angle matches pretty well. And then we'll go back to the logo, increase the roughness back up. At this point, we can rotate this HDRI to maybe hopefully get some catch lighting on the bevel. So you can see right here, that's what I'm targeting because it does look a bit flat on that bottom side. Now the sweep light, I'll lower the intensity to 50 and then increase the size a bit to make it a bit broader. And let's switch back to the timeline. We'll have the top layer come in. Then let's say at frame 150, we can start having this sweep light come in from left to right. So move it there. I believe we only have to add a keyframe to the X location and then move it over to 189 and then move it to the other side. Set another keyframe. Go back into the graph editor. Let's frame those and then switch it to linear. So we have this constant motion. And also I want to animate the power of that light. So at first there's no intensity. Set a keyframe. As it moves in, we go up to 50. Set a keyframe. Set a keyframe here and then move over, set it down to 0. So it just goes away. And by the way, we can go back to camera 1 just to see how things are looking. I'm thinking the bottom layer, it's a bit too thick, so we can just go in here and decrease the depth. And you can see here's the power of geometry nodes. We can just quickly make changes on the fly as we're animating without having to go deep into geometry nodes and all the noodles or even mess around with individual objects like we would do it traditionally before geometry nodes. So this just makes it so fun and so quick to iterate. And also at the end here, as the second layer settles in, I might want to lower the height of the second layer just so it's a bit more readable. Also, you can see the reflection of our top key light. So let's just increase this even more. But then we're going to also have to increase the power. Now, I want to quickly go over something very cool, which is light nodes. So let's select the sweep light. We'll go back to object type. Check use nodes. Now, just so I can demonstrate this a bit better, I'm going to go ahead and add a new plane. We'll move it to the side here. Let's go into edit mode. We'll scale it on the Y and then make it a bit thinner, just so the shape resembles the light a bit more. And we'll add a new material here, delete the principled shader, and let's just plug this directly into a gradient texture. And here we'll hit /, and here we'll drag this out, just focus on this. You can see the gradient texture generates a gradient from black to white, starting from the left side. And now we can add a color ramp node in between, and we'll add a new point, and we'll make the 2 points on the sides completely black and leave the middle point set to white. So it looks kind of like those tube lights you would see used in filmmaking. And then using a gamma node, we can tweak the softness of that. So this is just for visualization purposes, but now we can copy these nodes, go over to the sweep light and just paste them here and plug the color into the emission. You are going to see something weird happening. I'll just cut this off for the moment. Now let's add in a timeline real quick. So where's the light passing? Okay, right there. When I plug this in, you see it disappears. And that's because for some reason, these nodes, if I hit Ctrl T to bring a texture coordinate and mapping node, the vector here is using generated by default. And I don't know why, but when you're using light nodes, they don't really respect the light transformations unless you use the UV coordinates, and now it's gonna show up. So now as we scale the X, the light is scaling up, and then increase the strength here. So we can just have this very soft streak of light. And remember, because we're using black and white colors, wherever there is a black color, there's not going to be any light emission. But wherever there is white, there's going to be full light emission. And then we're just multiplying that strength with the emission node. And here I can demonstrate that a bit better if I just add more points here. And we'll turn this into black. And this one into white. You can control the overall horizontal or width size, and then you can set points to have more interesting light patterns. But let me just go back, undo, and I just want this single streak of light. And in fact, let me go back over to the compositor. Actually, I'll just go ahead and duplicate the glare node. Let me disable that. I'll bring in the mix to 1. This way we can see what we're affecting, and I'll increase the threshold until we're left with only the brightest parts. And now when we set it to 0, there's going to be full amount of glow. Bring this up just a little bit and also decrease the size so we have a tighter glow. And then on the second glare node, we'll leave it to 9, and then we'll lower the threshold so we're affecting more of it. So we have this softer fall off on the glow. Let's go ahead and let's search for a curves, RGB curves. We'll bring that before the glare nodes because I want to add some more contrast to this. Not too much, just a little bit. Then a hue saturation node, just to introduce some more saturation. We'll do 1.05. You see that just makes the colors pop even more. Be careful with this saturation value. It can sometimes be a bit too much. Then let's bring in an ellipse mask. And just so we can see what's happening, we can Control-Shift left click to bring up a viewer node. And let's just increase the width so it covers the whole screen. And by the way, you can see this is moving quite a lot faster than what you might have been used to when working with the Blender Compositor. And that's because of the fact that now Blender supports, where is it? Performance, GPU compositing. So make sure you're switch to that if you have a powerful enough GPU. Now let's add a blur node after it. Select both the X and Y and drag it out. So we have this smooth mask. Now we're going to use this as a mask to drive another RGB curve. So duplicate that. We'll delete these points. Plug the mask into the factor. Wherever there are white values, this curves effect is affecting those areas. And wherever there are black values, the curves effect is not affecting those areas. Now we want the opposite of that, so we'll just add in an invert color. So now we have this vignetting effect. And we want to be very subtle with this. And finally, after the glare, we'll add in a lens distortion node. And here, I'll just zoom in. We want to be very, very subtle with this. We don't want to overdo it. So let's say 0.05. And here we have this cool RGB splitting chromatic aberration effect. But again, just be very subtle with this. And you could even distort it if you want. Also, make sure to check fit. So it's going to automatically scale the whole image to get rid of those weird color issues in the corners there. Now, when we move back in the timeline, you see this cool dispersion, but I wouldn't go too far. Now, one last thing before we wrap this up with the outro, I just want to show you real quick how you would go about adding different kinds of materials to these different splines. So let's say the F1 layer 2 here. Let's say I want to have a different color on the top part, different one on the bottom part, and then another one on the right side part. Let's duplicate the base material. Let's set this back to base. We'll add another one and we'll choose that one. So we'll do base 2. And let's just make the color blue. Back in the geometry node editor, select the logo. Oh, and we have to select the modifier itself because if we choose another modifier, it's not going to show up. And then let's find layer 2. And here we're applying the material. But what we can do is actually use the selection to define which part of this shape we want to set this material to. Now, how do we access the information that we need to assign different materials to different parts? Well, again, we can use these store named attribute nodes. So just before we turn this into mesh, we're going to add a store named attribute in between the geometry here. And let's just plug it inside. And we want to store the information that has to do with the splines. And we want to set this to integer because on the value, we're using an index node to get the indices of those splines. In this case, it would be 0, 1, 2 because we have 3 shapes. And then let's just call this target. And then over here, we can type in named attribute to access that target. And let's just switch this to integer, plug it into the selection, and then type in the target name. And now I want to duplicate this. And for the first one, we'll set it back to base and then add a compare node to determine which splines we're targeting. So switch to integer because we want round number with indices. Then plug the attribute back to the A socket. So let's do equal. Now let me duplicate this real quick and plug the result back here. So now if we set these two nodes to equal, we can choose which index to apply this material to. And if we set this to 2, we can decide, oh, okay, we want the blue material, the base 2, to be applied to spline with the index of 2. That's this one. If we set it to 1, it's gonna apply it to this one, and then 0 should be that one. So in that case, if this is 0, we want to apply the red base material to anything greater than 0. So on this one, let's set it to greater than 0, which will apply the red material. And then on this one, we wanted to set it to equal, which will apply the blue material. All right, guys, that was all for this tutorial. So thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Don't forget to check out the project files in case you want to skip creating the whole thing from scratch, alongside which you can find a bunch of other projects from previous videos on this channel. So do check them out and stay tuned for more educational videos. Thank you once again for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.